So once again, it's spooky season, and to celebrate that, I thought we'd take a look at a Halloween classic. Aptly enough, today we're going to be taking a look at Halloween. Halloween is an independent horror slasher film released in 1978. It was directed by John Carpenter, and it would go on to be one of the few films that he made that would go on to be a commercial and critical success at the time of its release. Whereas most of Carpenter's other films would only be considered masterpieces sometime after their release. It was so successful, in fact, that it turned its budget of between $300,000 and $325,000 into a profit of somewhere between $60 and $70 million. So to say that this film was a success would be a huge understatement. Halloween would also go on to popularise the slasher genre and bring about something of a golden age in the slasher genre, which would last until around 1984 and gave us films like Friday the 13th and A Nightmare on Elm Street. Although Halloween didn't invent the slasher genre by any means, that honour actually very likely goes to Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, a film which Halloween actually draws quite a lot of inspiration from. Despite being so successful and influential at the time of its release, some critics were actually unimpressed by Halloween. Many critics accused the film of being empty, unsophisticated, and childish. The film was also accused of plagiarising Hitchcock. Although, some critics at the time of the film's release did speak more positively about it. For instance, the Miami Times called the film surprisingly good and terrifying. Despite a mixed critical reception at the time of its release, Halloween would go on to be held in high critical regard after it earned its status as a cult classic. An example of that is Halloween's 96% critic approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes. That's based on 72 critic reviews, and the general consensus among those critics is that the film is scary, suspenseful, and viscerally thrilling, which is a sentiment that I completely agree with. But with that said, let's go ahead and take a look at Halloween, see what it's like, and see if it deserves its status as a cult classic. The plot of Halloween begins on Halloween night in 1963 in the fictional town of Haddonfield, Illinois. On that night, 6-year-old Michael Myers inexplicably kills his teenage sister. After that, he's incarcerated in a psychiatric hospital for 15 years before escaping on October 30th, 1978. He then drives back to his hometown of Haddonfield and begins to stalk a group of 3 teenage girls. Now, it kind of goes without saying that Halloween's plot is fairly simplistic, but frankly when it comes to the slasher genre, keeping it simple is kind of the point, which is a good thing. The only purpose that this plot ever really had to serve is creating a setup for people to be murdered, and for that purpose it works pretty well. However, despite Halloween having a simplistic plot, I do still have some good things to say about this film's plot. The main one is that the plot is actually surprisingly down to earth and realistic. The film takes place in a small American town, and the killer is essentially just some guy. That feels like something that could happen to anyone, which really does add to the horror of this film. However, sadly, I do have some complaints about Halloween's plot. The main complaint is that at times Halloween can be fairly problematic. Halloween seems to borrow a lot of problematic tropes from Hitchcock's Psycho, and unfortunately, these tropes would actually be popularised by Halloween. The first problematic trope featured in Halloween is that the killer comes from a psychiatric hospital and has mental health conditions. Unfortunately, this trope leads to a lot of harmful stereotypes about people with mental health conditions, and it kind of goes without saying that this trope did not need to be here. Michael Myers could have been anyone without impacting the film at all, so the fact that he's someone with a mental health condition only serves to perpetuate a harmful stereotype. The other harmful trope in this film is that the women in this movie are presented as weak and are given little to no personal agency. Halloween very much popularised the last girl trope and other sexist tropes, and again, there's no reason why this trope had to be here. It only serves to perpetuate harmful stereotypes. Much like the previous trope, this one is probably just here as a result of lazy writing. The women in this film could have been much better represented, and they could have been given much more personal agency. Just look at a film like Alien, another horror film released around the same time. In that movie, the character of Ripley is given a lot of personal agency and has the ability to fight back against the alien. Why couldn't the female characters in this film have been represented in that way too? And it's such a shame that these tropes are here too, because it really does affect my enjoyment of this otherwise brilliant film. And I have to say, it probably ruined a bunch of other movies too, as Halloween without a doubt popularised these tropes. But I will say, if you're willing to look past the harmful tropes, Halloween's plot does work, and the setup is pretty brilliant for delivering horror. But moving on from that, let's talk about another extremely effective part of Halloween, how it delivers its scares. What makes it so effective is just how subtle it all is. While I understand that's not to everyone's taste, I personally prefer it to how in-your-face other horror films can be. Halloween really does work up to its scares, and it's extremely effective. In fact, for the first half of the film, nothing even really happens. We see Michael Myers stalking his victims, and that's about it. And I think that's exactly how it should be. The fear of not knowing when something is going to happen is far greater than the fear that comes from seeing something happen. And it's probably a good job that Halloween does do such a good job of building tension, because as you'd imagine, after such brilliant tension building, the payout really doesn't live up to the expectations. And really, how could they? Like, the payoff is usually something like, oh no, this guy in a scary mask is choking a girl. Spooky stuff, guys. Spooky stuff. I honestly really do like Halloween's bloodless approach to horror though. Seeing Michael Myers stalking someone for an hour is far scarier than anything that could be achieved with gore and shock horror. It really is very effective. Another part of Halloween which is remarkably impressive is the visuals. Part of what makes them so impressive is the fact that Halloween was actually one of the earliest films to use a Steadicam. This technology was new at the time, and it allowed for some seriously impressive tracking shots and point of view shots that would have probably been revolutionary at the time. I find the point of view shots to be particularly effective as they give us the horror of looking at what's going on from both the victim and the killer's perspective, both of which are truly horrifying in their own way. I also find the shots that follow behind the victims to be notable. This gives the audience the impression that they're right there next to the victim. Another part of Halloween that's typically held in very high regard is the sound design. Although personally I feel that it's a bit of a mixed bag. The soundtrack of the film is very good. The soundtrack is simple, but it does an excellent job of establishing a tense and dark mood for the film. And the idea of having a theme just for the killer is genius, and no doubt responsible for just how iconic this film's soundtrack is. However, despite the film's soundtrack being quite good, there are several aspects of this film's sound design that really doesn't work. For instance, at times the film tries to use these weird, loud, jarring noises. I can only assume that this is supposed to be a sort of jump scare, but to be honest, it really doesn't work, and it's just kind of out of place and immersion breaking. But other than that though, I do think that Halloween has some pretty effective sound design, particularly when it comes to the soundtrack. So in conclusion, that's Halloween. Besides a few problematic tropes and strange design choices here and there, I think that this is a pretty brilliant movie that's absolutely worth being considered one of the best horror films of all time. And although the subtle, bloodless approach used here isn't going to be to everyone's taste, I think that to the right person, this film makes a truly terrifying masterpiece. And although the problematic tropes do challenge my enjoyment of this film, I do think it's a very good film. But with that said, that's it for today's review. What do you think of Halloween? Let me know in the comment section below. But with that said, I thank you for watching and I will see you in the next video.